After a single, unforgettable night with a mysterious stranger at a charity gala, Sofia discovers she's pregnant. The father is none other than Alessandro Bianchi, the ruthless heir to the family that has been her own family's sworn enemy for 2 generations. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. The Fontana Charity Gala was the kind of event where diamonds outnumbered honest intentions, and Sofia Moretti had learned long ago how to move through rooms like this without giving anything of herself away. She wore black, always black, a silk gown that clung to her like a second secret, and a mask of white feathers that hid the upper half of her face. A small mercy, since it meant no one could see her eyes when they lied. She was not supposed to be enjoying herself. Her father had made that clear before she'd even stepped out of the car. Smile, be seen, say nothing that matters. The Moretti family did not attend galas for pleasure. They attended to remind the city that they still existed, that 2 generations of blood feud with the Bianchi family had not erased them from the map of power that ran beneath New York like a second circulatory system. She was standing near the terrace doors, a glass of champagne going warm in her hand, when she felt him before she saw him. That was the strange part, later, when she tried to explain it to herself. Not the sight of him, but the sensation, low and electric, of being watched by someone who did not care that she noticed. She turned, and there he was. He wore no mask. That was his first act of defiance, though she didn't know it yet. A man choosing to be recognized in a room full of people hiding. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed in a black suit that had clearly been cut for exactly the shape of him, and his eyes, when they found hers, were the colour of a storm that hadn't decided yet whether it would break. "You're the only person in this room not pretending to be having a good time," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that assumed it would be listened to. "Maybe I'm an excellent actress." "You're not," he said. "You're bored and a little angry. It's in your shoulders." She should have walked away. Every instinct her father had drilled into her, trust no one at these events, especially no one who looks at you like he already knows your secrets, told her to put 10 feet of marble floor between them. Instead, she found herself asking, "And what gives you the right to read my shoulders?" "Practice," he said, and something in the corner of his mouth almost became a smile. "Dance with me." "I don't know you." "Good," he said. "Then there's nothing to ruin it." She would think later that this was the moment she should have recognized the danger. Not in his face, which was unreadable, but in the ease with which he made not knowing sound like an invitation instead of a warning. But the champagne was doing its slow work in her blood, and the music had shifted into something with a heartbeat, and she let him take her hand. He danced like a man who had never once in his life worried about being led. His palm was warm against the small of her back, steady, proprietary, in a way that should have offended her, and instead made something low in her stomach tighten with a feeling she refused to name. They didn't speak for the length of the song. She watched his throat, the line of his jaw, the small white scar above his left eyebrow that suggested a life that hadn't always been spent in ballrooms. "You're not going to tell me your name?" she said finally. "Would it matter?" "It might." "Then no," he said. "Not tonight. Tonight I'd rather you looked at me, and not at whatever comes with my name." There was something almost tender in the way he said it, a rare crack of honesty in a room built entirely of performance, and Sofia, who had spent 26 years being the daughter of a man who wore his name like armour, felt something in her chest loosen dangerously. "That's either the most honest thing anyone said to me tonight," she murmured, "or the most practiced lie." "Maybe both," he admitted. "Does it matter, if it's the truth in this moment?" She should have laughed it off. Instead, she let him lead her out to the terrace, away from the noise, where the city glittered beneath them like something that could be owned if he were only bold enough to reach for it. He didn't touch her there, not yet. He only stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, and looked at her with an intensity that made the mask feel suddenly insufficient, a thin barrier against a man who seemed to see straight through feathers and silk to the woman underneath. "I have a car," he said finally, "and I have a penthouse with a view better than this one. And I have absolutely no interest in spending the rest of tonight sharing you with 300 strangers." It was reckless. It was everything she had been raised not to do. She thought of her father's voice, of the Bianchi name that haunted every family dinner like a curse spoken over the table, of the years of careful, bloodless war between two families who had once, long ago, been something like allies. She thought of none of that enough to stop herself. "Take me," she said, "somewhere the masks don't matter." He smiled then, really smiled, for the first time, and it changed his whole face, softened the danger in it just enough that she nearly missed the warning in his eyes. "Careful what you ask for," he said, and took her hand. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower that seemed to have been built specifically to look down on the rest of the city, and Sofia understood, the moment the elevator doors opened directly into his living room, that she was standing inside a kind of wealth that didn't advertise itself with gold and marble, but with silence, with space, with the particular arrogance of a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't turn on all the lights. He left most of the apartment in shadow, lit only by the city glow through floor-to-ceiling windows, as if he understood that some things were better half seen. "You still haven't told me your name," she said, setting her clutch down on a table that probably cost more than her car. "You still haven't asked twice," he said, shrugging off his jacket. "I take that as permission to keep it that way." "Is that how this works? A whole night and no names?" "Names complicate things," he said, moving toward her slowly, the way a man moves when he already knows the outcome and is only savouring the space before it. "Names come with families, debts, enemies. Tonight, I'd like to be a man who has none of those things, just for a few hours." She understood that feeling more than she wanted to admit. She had spent her entire life being Sofia Moretti first and herself a distant second, a name that opened doors and closed them just as fast, a name that made men look at her like a transaction waiting to happen. To be nameless tonight was its own kind of freedom. "Then I'll be no one too," she said. "You could never be no one," he said, and the words landed with more weight than the moment called for, though she didn't understand why until much later. He reached out and slid the mask from her face, slow, deliberate, as if unwrapping something he intended to keep. "There you are." His hand cradled her jaw, and she felt the calluses on his fingers, not the hands of a man who spent his life in boardrooms alone, and something about that roughness made her breath catch. "Who are you?" she whispered, unable to stop herself, even knowing he wouldn't answer. Tonight, he murmured against her mouth, I'm whoever you need me to be. He kissed her, like he had been waiting his whole life for permission, and she gave into it with a hunger that frightened her a little, because she had never let herself want anything this openly, this recklessly. His hands were sure on her body, unbuttoning, unwrapping, worshipful and possessive all at once, and she found herself gripping the front of his shirt to keep from losing her balance entirely. They didn't make it to the bedroom at first. He pressed her back against the cool glass of the window, the city spread out beneath them like a field of stars they had fallen from, and murmured filthy, tender things against her throat that made her forget every rule she'd ever been taught about self-control. Say you want this, he said, low, his forehead resting against hers, giving her one last chance to pull away. I want this, she breathed. I want you. Later, in his bed, with the sheets tangled around them and the first hint of dawn beginning to bruise the edges of the sky, she lay with her head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat slow into something steady and unhurried, and thought that she had never in her life felt so thoroughly seen by a man whose name she didn't even know. Stay until morning, he said, his fingers tracing idle patterns down her spine. It is morning. Then stay until I have to let you go. She smiled against his skin, foolish and warm and unguarded in a way she would spend the next several weeks trying to unlearn. You say that like it's inevitable, like you already know we won't see each other again. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its warmth, gone thoughtful, almost sad. Some things are inevitable, he said. I just don't know yet if this is one of them. She should have asked what he meant. She should have pushed the way she pushed at everything else in her life that resisted her curiosity. Instead, she let herself drift into a few hours of sleep, more peaceful than any she'd had in years. And when she woke, the sun was fully up, and the other side of the bed was empty and cold, and there was no note, no name, no way to find him again. Only the mask, folded neatly on the pillow beside her, feathers smoothed flat, as if he had wanted her to know that he, too, had wanted to remember. She dressed in yesterday's gown and let herself out into a morning that felt too bright for what she'd done, and told herself, all the way down in the elevator, that this was exactly what it had been meant to be, one perfect, anonymous night gone by the time the sun came up. She did not yet know his name was Alessandro Bianchi. She did not yet know that in 6 weeks she would learn it in the worst possible way, carved into the side of a warehouse her father's men burned to the ground, the name of the enemy who had, without either of them intending it, planted the beginning of a life inside her. 6 weeks later, Sofia stood in the marble foyer of her father's estate in Westchester, staring at a pregnancy test she had taken 3 times because the first 2 results had felt like a mistake the universe would surely correct if she was patient enough. It did not correct itself. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, the little plastic stick trembling in her hand, and did the math over and over, praying for a different answer each time and getting the same one, no matter how she counted. There had been no one else, not in months, which meant the father of the child growing inside her was a man whose name she had never learned, whose face she remembered with a clarity that frightened her, whose hands she could still feel sometimes at 3 in the morning when the house was silent and her guilt had nowhere else to go. She had almost convinced herself she could live with the mystery, that some nights weren't meant to be solved, only carried, when her father called her down to his study with a voice that told her something in the world had shifted. Don Matteo Moretti was 61 years old and looked every year of it that night. Deep lines carved into a face that had once, in old photographs, been almost handsome. He stood at the window with a glass of scotch he wasn't drinking, watching smoke rise somewhere in the distance beyond the tree line, though the fire itself had burned out hours ago. "We hit one of their warehouses tonight," he said, without turning around. "Bianchi's shipping operation on the East River should set them back months." Sofia felt the name land in her stomach like a stone dropped into still water. She had heard it her whole life. Bianchi, spoken always with a curl of the lip, a tightening of the jaw, the word itself functioning as a kind of curse in her family's private vocabulary. 2 generations of blood, betrayal, and territory drawn and redrawn in the aftermath of a war that had started before she was born and that no one alive could fully explain anymore, except to say that a Bianchi had once killed a Moretti, and a Moretti had once killed a Bianchi, and the ledger of debts had simply never been allowed to close. "Any casualties?" she asked, because it was expected of her to ask, though her mind was elsewhere entirely. "2 of theirs," her father said. "None of ours. A good night." He finally turned, and his eyes, sharp, assessing, the same eyes that had taught her to read a room before she could read a book, settled on her with the particular attention he reserved for matters of family business. "You look pale." "I'm tired," she said. "The gala circuit is exhausting." "You'll rest when we've won," he said, which was what he always said, as though winning were a finish line instead of a horizon that kept retreating no matter how far they ran toward it. Speaking of which, Alessandro Bianchi was seen at the Fontana Gala 6 weeks ago. My sources say he left with a woman. No mask, if you can believe the arrogance of it, wanted to be seen. The room seemed to tilt slightly, though nothing in it had moved. "Alessandro Bianchi," she repeated, testing the shape of the name in her mouth, feeling it settle into place beside the memory of a man who had refused to give her his name and had instead given her everything else: his hands, his mouth, the low murmur of his voice in the dark, a night that had felt like the only honest thing in her carefully performed life. No mask, tall, dark hair, a storm-coloured gaze that had looked at her like she was the only real thing in a room built of glass and lies. Her father misread her stillness as disgust. "I know," he said, mistaking her silence for solidarity. "The man has no shame. Word is he's taken over most of his father's operations now. Cold as ice, they say, doesn't blink when he gives an order. 28 years old, and already more dangerous than his father ever was." He shook his head. "If I ever find the woman foolish enough to have shared his bed, I'd tell her to pray she never crosses paths with him again. A man like that doesn't love. He collects." Sofia said nothing. She excused herself as soon as she could manage it without raising suspicion, climbed the stairs to her room on legs that didn't feel entirely her own, and sat on the edge of her bed with her hand pressed flat against her still flat stomach, staring at the ceiling as the truth assembled itself into a shape she couldn't unsee. The father of her child was Alessandro Bianchi, the son of the family that had spent 2 generations trying to destroy her own. The man her father would kill without hesitation if he ever learned the truth. and the man who, 6 weeks ago, had held her like she mattered more than any war. She pressed both hands over her mouth to keep from making a sound, and let herself cry, finally, for the mess she hadn't known she was making, and for the child who had not asked to be born into the middle of it. Alessandro Bianchi did not believe in ghosts, but he had spent 6 weeks being haunted by a woman whose name he'd never asked for. He told himself it was nothing, a good night, better than most, the kind of encounter a man in his position rarely allowed himself. No bodyguards stationed outside the door, no careful vetting beforehand, just a woman in a feathered mask who had looked at him like he was a person and not an empire. He told himself that was exactly why it had felt the way it did, and exactly why it meant nothing beyond the 4 walls of that one night. He was lying to himself, and he knew it every time he stood at the window of his penthouse and found his eyes drawn to the spot on the glass where he had kissed her, as though the memory had etched itself into the architecture of his life. "You're distracted," his cousin Dante said, dropping into the chair across from his desk without invitation, the way he always did, the privilege of having grown up together in a house full of men who trusted almost no one else. 3 weeks running. I've never seen you like this. I'm not distracted. I'm thorough, Alessandro said, not looking up from the shipping ledgers spread across his desk, the ones documenting, in cold financial terms, exactly how much the Moretti attack on his East River warehouse had cost him. 2 men dead, product destroyed, a message sent, loud and unmistakable. The war was not over, no matter how many years had passed since the last open bloodshed. "You're distracted," Dante repeated, unbothered by the correction. "It started right around the Fontana Gala. I did the math. You want to tell me who she was, or should I keep guessing?" Alessandro's jaw tightened, the only outward sign that the question had landed anywhere close to true. "There's nothing to tell." Uh-huh. Dante leaned back, studying his cousin with the particular amusement of a man who had known him since they were both boys throwing rocks into the Hudson and dreaming of being anything other than what their fathers had made them. Alessandro Bianchi, cold as a February morning, hasn't looked twice at a woman in 3 years, suddenly can't stop staring out windows like a man waiting for a ship to come in. Must have been some night. "Drop it." "Fine." Dante held up his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes stayed sharp. "But if you ever do want to talk about it, about anything, I'm here." "You know that." Alessandro did know that, and it was, in its way, the only real comfort in a life otherwise defined by suspicion. He had been raised from the age of 12 to understand that the family business was not a business at all, but a war conducted with better tailoring, that every handshake carried the risk of a blade behind it, that the Moretti name was to be spoken with contempt, and the Moretti family destroyed by whatever means necessary, because that was what had been done to his uncle and his grandfather before that, in a cycle of retaliation neither side seemed able or willing to end. He had become, by 28, exactly what that upbringing demanded: precise, unemotional, capable of ordering violence without losing sleep over it, because sleep was a luxury for men who didn't have an empire to protect. His father, Salvatore Bianchi, had stepped back from daily operations 2 years ago after a stroke had left him diminished, and Alessandro had absorbed the full weight of the family's business and its enemies without complaint, because complaint was not a language he had been taught. And yet, there had been a woman in a white feathered mask, who had looked at him without an ounce of fear, without the careful calculation he saw in every other face that turned toward him. And for one night he had been, simply, a man. Not an heir, not a weapon, not the next name on someone's list of grievances. He had wanted, badly, to know her name. He had wanted it so badly that he had deliberately not asked, because some part of him had understood, even then, that if he learned who she was, the night would end the moment he did. He was still turning that thought over when his phone buzzed with a message from his father's oldest advisor, Enzo, requesting an urgent meeting regarding family matters requiring discretion. Alessandro closed the ledger, rubbed a hand over his tired eyes, and told himself one more time that the woman from the gala was a closed chapter. He did not yet know that in 3 weeks she would walk back into his life, carrying a secret that would reopen every wound the two families had ever inflicted on each other, and that this time there would be no walking away from what they'd started. Sofia spent 3 days deciding whether Alessandro Bianchi deserved to know he was going to be a father, and every argument she constructed against telling him collapsed under the weight of one simple, stubborn fact. It was true, and truth had a way of surfacing no matter how deep you buried it. She could not tell her father. That much was certain beyond any doubt. Matteo Moretti would not see a grandchild in her belly. He would see a Bianchi, an infiltration, a wound in the family's carefully guarded bloodline. And Sofia was not naive enough to believe he would react with anything but fury. Fury directed first at her, and then, with far more lethal intention, at the man responsible. She thought about disappearing. She had money of her own, a small trust from her late mother that her father didn't fully control. Enough to vanish somewhere quiet and raise a child alone, far from warehouses and warlords and names spoken like curses. She turned the idea over for an entire sleepless night, and found she couldn't make herself believe in it. A child deserved more than a mother running scared, and some small, treacherous part of her, the part that still remembered the weight of his hand at the small of her back, wanted Alessandro Bianchi to know. Not because she expected him to love her, she wasn't foolish enough for that fantasy, but because she remembered a version of him for one night who had looked at her like the rest of the world had stopped existing, and she owed it to the child growing inside her to at least give the truth a chance before she buried it. Finding him was easier than she expected, and harder than she wanted. She used her mother's maiden name to secure a meeting at Bianchi Holdings' downtown offices under the pretense of a charity partnership inquiry, a thin cover, but the kind of thin cover that worked precisely because no one expected a Moretti to be brazen enough to walk into Bianchi territory in broad daylight. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than the 6 weeks that had passed since the gala. She smoothed the front of her blazer, checked her reflection in the brushed steel doors, and reminded herself, uselessly, that she had survived worse conversations than this. She hadn't. She knew she hadn't. But the lie steadied her hands as the doors opened onto a reception area of glass and steel that radiated the same cold, deliberate luxury she remembered from his penthouse. "Ms. Marchetti," the receptionist said, using the alias Sofia had given. "Mr. Bianchi will see you now." The office doors opened, and there he was, behind a desk the size of a small boat, dressed in a charcoal suit instead of the black one she remembered, his dark hair combed back instead of falling loose across his forehead. And for one disorienting second, she almost doubted her own memory, almost believed she had imagined the whole night into being. Then he looked up, and recognition moved across his face like weather. Surprise first, sharp and unguarded, followed almost instantly by something more careful, more controlled, the mask of the businessman sliding back into place, a beat too late to hide what had been underneath it. "You," he said, low, and rose from his chair without seeming to decide to. "Me," she agreed. "Close the door," he said to his assistant, who obeyed without question and left them alone in a silence that filled up the enormous office like water rising in a room with no drain. "I've spent 6 weeks," he said finally, coming around the desk, "trying to convince myself you didn't exist." "I've spent 6 weeks trying to convince myself I imagined the whole thing," she said. "It would have been easier that way." "Why?" His eyes moved over her face like he was relearning it, cataloguing every detail he'd apparently memorized and doubted in equal measure. Why would it have been easier? Sofia felt the words gather in her throat, heavy and irreversible, and understood that there was no version of the next 30 seconds that didn't change both their lives permanently. "Because," she said, "I know your name now, Alessandro Bianchi, and you're about to learn mine. And after that, nothing about this is going to be simple ever again." His expression sharpened, wary now, the businessman and the man who'd held her in the dark merging into something new and watchful. "Who are you?" "Sofia Moretti," she said, and watched the name land in him like a blade finding its mark. "And I'm pregnant with your child." For a long moment, Alessandro Bianchi said nothing at all. Sofia watched the silence stretch across his face in stages, disbelief first, then something that looked almost like grief, then a cold and total stillness that frightened her more than any shouted rage could have, because it meant he was calculating, running every possible consequence through the machinery of a mind trained since childhood to see every piece of information as a weapon or a liability. "Say that again," he said finally, his voice stripped of all warmth. "Sofia Moretti," she repeated, holding his gaze though every instinct told her to look away. "Daughter of Matteo Moretti. And yes, I'm certain, and yes, it's yours." "You're certain," he repeated flatly, "of both things." "I'm not here to convince you of my honesty, Alessandra. I'm here because you deserved to know, and because I refuse to spend the rest of my life lying to a child about who its father is." Her voice shook slightly on the last word, and she hated herself for the weakness, even as she refused to apologize for it. "You can believe me or not. That's your choice. But I'm not asking you for anything. I didn't come here for money or protection or a place in your family. I came because it was the right thing to do. And I wanted to do it once, in this life, before everything else takes over." Something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, but a recalibration, as though he had expected an ambush and found instead a woman standing unarmed in the middle of the room she'd walked into. He moved to the window, put his back to her, and she watched the tension gather in his shoulders like a storm building offshore. "Do you understand what you've just told me?" he said without turning. "A Moretti, pregnant, with a Bianchi's child. If your father learns of this before I decide what to do about it, he will kill you himself before he lets that child be born a threat to his bloodline's purity. And if my father learns of it, he will see only one thing, an opportunity to finally end the Moretti line, using a child as leverage, or worse. "I know," she said quietly. "I've thought about little else for 3 days." He turned back to face her, and for the first time since she'd walked in, she saw something in his eyes that resembled the man from the gala. Not the calculating Heir, but the man who had traced idle patterns on her spine at 4 in the morning and told her with something like wonder that she could never be no one. "Why didn't you just disappear?" he asked, quieter now. "You could have. No one would have ever known." "I thought about it," she admitted. "I have money of my own. I could have vanished, raised the child somewhere far from all of this, and let you live the rest of your life never knowing. Part of me wanted to." She swallowed hard. "But I kept thinking about what it would mean. Growing up without ever knowing where half of you came from. I couldn't do that. Not even to spare myself all of this." Alessandro crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that she could feel the same heat radiating off him that she remembered from the terrace 6 weeks and a lifetime ago. "I am not a good man, Sofia," he said, low and deliberate, as though it cost him something to admit it. "I have done things in service of my family that would earn me a place in hell twice over. I do not know how to be gentle, and I do not know how to be trusted, and I have absolutely no idea how to be a father. But I know this." His hand came up, hovering near her cheek without quite touching, as if he needed permission he wasn't sure how to ask for. "I will not let either of our families use that child as a weapon. Whatever else happens between us, whatever this becomes, I promise you that." "You can't promise that," she said, though her voice had gone soft, uncertain. "You don't have that kind of control. Neither of us do." "I have exactly that kind of control," he said, and something cold and immovable settled into his voice. The voice, she understood suddenly, that men obeyed without question. "I run an empire built on the ability to make promises and keep them by force if necessary. I am telling you, that child will be protected, and so will you. Even from your own father." His jaw tightened. "Especially from my own father." The weight of that promise settled over the room like a held breath, and Sofia found herself believing him, even as every rational instinct screamed that she shouldn't, that a Bianchi's promise to a Moretti was, by definition, worth nothing at all, a paper treaty in a war built on broken ones. But she had seen his face when she'd said the word pregnant, had watched grief and fury and something achingly protective move through him in the space of a single breath, and she understood, with the sinking clarity of a woman falling for exactly the wrong man, that this was no longer a story about 2 enemy families. It was a story about a child who had not asked to be born into a war, and 2 people who were about to risk everything to keep that child out of it. Enzo Ricci had served the Bianchi family for 31 years, long enough to have carried Alessandro on his shoulders as a boy, and long enough now to be the only man in the organization who could walk into Alessandro's office unannounced without risking his life for the presumption. He did so on the afternoon following Sofia's visit, closing the door behind him with the particular quiet of a man who already suspected what he would find. "Tell me it isn't true," Enzo said, without preamble. Alessandro did not look up from the window, where he had been standing for the better part of an hour, watching the city below without seeing any of it. "Which part?" "Any of it. The woman in the lobby yesterday. My man on the front desk said her name was Marchetti, but he also said she left in a car registered to the Moretti estate. Enzo's voice, usually gravel-soft with age and loyalty, sharpened into something closer to alarm. "Tell me you didn't sleep with a Moretti." "I didn't know who she was," Alessandro said. "Not that night." "And now?" "Now I know everything," Alessandro said, and finally turned, and whatever Enzo saw in his face made the old man's shoulders sag with the particular grief of a person watching a disaster he cannot stop. Alessandro. Enzo said his name the way he had when Alessandro was 9 years old and had tried to sneak out to follow his father on a job he was too young to understand. Whatever this is, whatever you're thinking of doing, you need to understand what's at stake. If Matteo Moretti finds out his daughter is carrying a Bianchi child, he will not hesitate. He will kill her before he lets that baby be born, because to him that child isn't a grandchild. It's an act of war against his own bloodline. And if your father finds out first, "I know what my father will do," Alessandro said, quiet and lethal. "He'll try to use the child as a hostage against Moretti, force a surrender through blood he considers half his own. I know exactly what both of them will do, Enzo. That's precisely why neither of them is going to find out until I've built a wall around her that neither family can breach. You can't hide a pregnant woman from two of the most powerful crime families in this city forever." "I don't need forever," Alessandro said. "I need enough time to end this war permanently, so there's nothing left to hide her from." Enzo stared at him for a long moment, and Alessandro watched something shift in the old man's face. Not agreement, not yet, but a kind of resigned recognition. The look of a man who had spent 3 decades watching a boy become exactly the kind of leader who didn't ask permission before deciding to burn down the rules he'd inherited. "Your father built this empire on the war with the Morettis," Enzo said carefully. "Ending it, truly ending it, not just another temporary ceasefire, would mean dismantling half of what he spent his life building. He won't allow it. Not without a fight." "Then he'll fight me," Alessandro said, and there was no hesitation in it at all, only the flat, immovable certainty of a man who had already made his decision and was simply informing the world of it. "I'm not asking for his blessing, Enzo. I'm telling you what's going to happen, because you're the only person in this family I trust to help me do it without getting anyone killed in the process." Enzo was quiet for a long time, studying the younger man he had known since infancy, searching his face for some sign of the recklessness of youth, some flicker of a decision made in the heat of unexpected fatherhood rather than in cold calculation. He didn't find it. What he found instead was something he hadn't seen in Alessandro's eyes since before his mother died. An actual want, undisguised, unguarded, the kind of want that made men do impossible things. "You care for her," Enzo said. It wasn't a question. Alessandro's jaw worked once, twice, before he answered. "I don't know her," he said. "Not really. One night and a conversation in my office. That's all I have." "That's not what I asked." The silence that followed answered the question more completely than words could have. "God help us both," Enzo muttered, and rubbed a hand over his weathered face. "All right, tell me what you need." "First," Alessandro said, already moving back toward his desk, already thinking 3 moves ahead in the way that had made him formidable even as a teenager. "I need eyes on the Moretti estate, discreet. I need to know Sofia's schedule, her security, whether her father suspects anything at all. Second, I need a property, somewhere off the grid, unconnected to either family, where she can stay if things move faster than we can control. And third, he paused, and something almost vulnerable crossed his face before the mask came back down. Third, I need you to help me figure out how to protect a woman who doesn't trust me from a war she didn't start, without turning her into exactly the kind of prisoner her father already treats her like. Enzo studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll make the calls," he said. "But Alessandro, if this goes the way I think it might, you're not just risking your life. You're risking everything your family has built for 2 generations." "Then it's a good thing," Alessandro said with the ghost of a humorless smile, "that I've never much cared what my family built. I only care what I build next." Sofia noticed the black sedan on the 3rd day. It idled half a block from the small cafe where she'd taken to having her morning coffee alone, far enough from the estate that she could pretend for an hour to be an ordinary woman with an ordinary life. She had grown up around surveillance the way other children grew up around family pets, an ever-present, half-noticed feature of daily existence, and she recognized immediately the particular stillness of a car whose driver was not waiting for anyone in the cafe, but was, instead, watching her. Her first instinct was fear. Her second, sharper instinct, arriving almost as quickly, was a kind of resigned certainty about whose men they were. She paid for her coffee, left through the side door, and doubled back through an alley she'd used as a shortcut since childhood, coming up behind the sedan close enough to rap her knuckles against the driver's window before he had time to react. The window rolled down to reveal a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who had the good grace, at least, to look embarrassed at being caught. "You can tell Alessandro," she said, before the man could speak, "that if he wants to know where I am, he can ask me himself instead of having me followed like a criminal." The driver's radio crackled. A beat later, he handed her the receiver without a word, and Sofia took it with more composure than she felt. "You weren't supposed to notice him," Alessandro's voice said, low and rough, with something that might have been amusement. "I notice everything," Sofia said. "It's the only skill my father ever actually bothered to teach me." "I'm not trying to control you," Alessandro said, and the humour drained out of his voice, replaced by something more careful. "I'm trying to keep you alive. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always look like one from where you're standing." "It looks exactly like the same thing from where I'm standing," she said. "My whole life, men have decided what's best for me and called it protection. I don't need another one." There was a pause on the line, long enough that she thought he might have hung up, and then, "Have dinner with me tonight. Not a car outside a cafe, not a driver relaying messages, just you and me. And I'll tell you everything I'm doing and why. And you can decide for yourself whether it's protection or control." She should have said no. She had a dozen good reasons ready on her tongue, chief among them the fact that every hour she spent near Alessandro Bianchi was an hour that brought her closer to her father discovering the truth in the worst possible way. But there was something in his voice, an openness she hadn't expected, a willingness to be questioned that didn't match the reputation her father had painted of a man who never blinked when giving an order, that made her hesitate. "Where?" she said finally, and heard him exhale, some tension leaving his voice. "I'll send the address," he said. "Come alone. No sedans, no drivers, just you." That evening, she found herself standing in front of a townhouse in a quiet, unremarkable neighborhood in Brooklyn, nothing like the glass tower where she'd first learned his name, nothing like the marble estate where she'd been raised. The door opened before she could knock, and Alessandro stood there in a simple grey sweater, sleeves pushed up, looking younger and less armoured than she had ever seen him. "This isn't what I expected," she admitted, stepping inside to find a modest, warmly lit home. Bookshelves, a worn leather couch, the smell of something cooking that had nothing to do with a private chef. "It's not registered to me," he said, closing the door behind her. "It was my mother's before she died. My father doesn't know I kept it. I come here when I need to remember I'm allowed to be a person, and not just an inheritance." Something in his voice, quiet and unguarded, made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. "I'm sorry about your mother," she said. "She died when I was 19. Cancer. My father barely left his office for the funeral." He led her toward the small kitchen, where a pot simmered on the stove, and the domesticity of it, Alessandro Bianchi, feared heir to an empire of violence, standing at a stove stirring sauce, struck her as almost surreal. "I learned to cook from her. It's the only thing I do that has nothing to do with the family business." "Why show me this?" Sofia asked. "The real you, the house no one knows about." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes. "Because you deserve to know who you're actually dealing with," he said. "Not the man my enemies fear. Not the man your father warned you about. Just this. Whatever this is." She felt something dangerous shift inside her chest. Some careful wall she'd spent 6 weeks reinforcing, beginning, quietly, to crack. "That's a dangerous thing to show a Moretti," she said softly. "Maybe," he agreed, turning back to the stove, "but I'm starting to think you're worth the danger." They fell over the following weeks into something neither of them had a name for. It was not a courtship in any traditional sense. There were no public dates, no flowers sent to an office where curious eyes might ask questions, no dinners at restaurants where either of their names might be recognized. Instead, there was the townhouse in Brooklyn and stolen hours arranged through a rotating cast of untraceable numbers, and a growing, terrifying tenderness that neither of them seemed able to stop, no matter how many times they reminded each other of all the reasons they should. "You're doing the thing again," Alessandro said one evening, watching her from across the kitchen island as she absently pressed a hand to her still barely there stomach, a gesture that had become unconscious in the weeks since she'd told him. "What thing?" "Disappearing into your head. You do it every time you think about your father." He came around the island, close enough that she could smell the faint cedar of his cologne, close enough that her pulse did the traitorous thing it always did in his proximity. "Talk to me." "I keep thinking about the day he finds out," she admitted. "Not if. When. I've watched that man plan the destruction of enemies my whole life, Alessandro. I know exactly what he's capable of, and I can't stop imagining what he'll do when he learns his own daughter is carrying the enemy's child." "He won't touch you," Alessandro said, low and immovable. "I've told you that, and I meant it." "You can't promise that from a townhouse in Brooklyn," she said, some of her old sharpness returning. "You can't promise that from anywhere. My father has killed men for less than this. Do you understand that? Not ordered killed. Killed himself with his own hands because he believes some sins are too personal to delegate." "I understand exactly what your father is capable of," Alessandro said, and something dark moved behind his eyes, an old grief surfacing. "My uncle Marco died by Matteo Moretti's own hand 11 years ago. I was 17. I watched my father collapse at the funeral in a way I'd never seen before or since. So don't mistake my calm for naivety, Sofia. I know precisely who I'm protecting you from. That's exactly why I intend to win. The weight of that history settled between them, a reminder, even in the softest moments, of the blood that ran beneath everything they were building. And yet, Sofia found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. She had watched him over these weeks be patient in ways her father had never once been patient, gentle in ways she had assumed the Bianchi name made impossible. He asked about her mother, who had died when Sofia was 14, and listened without interrupting as she described a woman who had loved gardening and old films and had taught her daughter to read tarot cards in secret, away from her husband's disapproving eye. He remembered the smallest details, that she took her coffee with too much sugar, that she hated the sound of her own laugh and tried to suppress it, that she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever a door slammed too hard, an old reflex from a childhood spent flinching at her father's temper. "You notice everything," she said one night, curled against his side on the worn leather couch, his fingers moving idly through her hair in a way that had become, without either of them announcing it, a habit. "I told you," he murmured against her temple. "Practice." "Practice for what?" "Surviving men who don't want to be understood," he said. "I learned young that the only way to stay one step ahead of danger was to see it before it saw you. I just never expected to use that skill, to fall for the daughter of my family's oldest enemy." She lifted her head to look at him, startled by the word he'd used, and watched something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, that he'd said it aloud at all. "4," she repeated softly. "That's a big word, Alessandro Bianchi." "I know," he said, and didn't take it back. "I've been trying to find the smaller one for weeks. I can't." She should have been afraid of what that admission meant, the danger it represented, the war it would ignite the moment either family learned the truth. Instead, she felt something in her chest bloom open, warm and terrifying, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had walked into this pregnant and frightened, and had somehow, impossibly, found something that felt like the beginning of a home. "I'm falling too," she admitted, quiet, into the space between them. "God help us both." He kissed her then, slow and unhurried, like a man with nowhere else in the world he needed to be, and for a little while, in that small house that belonged to no family and no war, they let themselves believe it might actually be that simple. The illusion of safety lasted 11 weeks, and it ended on a Tuesday morning with a phone call that made Alessandro's blood run cold. "We have a problem," Enzo said, without any of his usual preamble, and Alessandro knew immediately, from the tightness in the old man's voice, that whatever had happened was worse than anything they'd prepared for. "One of my men on the Moretti surveillance detail was made last night, followed back to a safe house, questioned. He didn't talk. I'd stake my life on his loyalty. But Matteo's people know now that someone's been watching the estate. They don't know why yet. But they will start asking questions, and it won't take long before someone connects the dots to you." Alessandro was already moving, pulling on his jacket, mind racing through contingencies he'd spent weeks building and hoping never to need. "Where's Sofia now?" "At the estate, as far as I know. It's Tuesday. She has her weekly lunch with her father at noon." "Get a car to the townhouse," Alessandro said, I need to reach her before that lunch. But he was already too late. Sofia sat across from her father in the estate's formal dining room, the same room she'd eaten in her entire life, surrounded by the same dark wood and heavy silver her mother had once hated and never been allowed to change, and watched Matteo Moretti study her with an expression she had learned over 26 years to fear more than any shouted rage. "You've been different lately," he said, cutting into his veal with unhurried precision. "Softer, distracted. I noticed it weeks ago and told myself it was nothing, a woman's moods. But I don't believe in coincidences, Sofia, and I especially don't believe in them when my security chief tells me an unfamiliar car has been photographed near this estate no less than 6 times in the past 2 months. Sofia kept her face carefully still, drawing on every hour of training her father himself had given her, the same lessons in composure he was now, ironically, testing against her. "I don't know anything about a car, Papa." "No?" He set down his fork with deliberate care, the small sound of silver against china somehow louder than a gunshot in the sudden silence. "Then perhaps you can explain why you've been unreachable most evenings for the past 2 months. Why your driver reports drop-offs at locations that don't match any friend or engagement I'm aware of. Why, 3 days ago, you were seen entering a townhouse in Brooklyn, registered to a shell company that, when my people dug deeper, traces back, through 4 layers of paperwork designed to hide exactly this, to Bianchi Holdings." The room went very cold. Sofia felt the blood drain from her face, despite every ounce of self-control she possessed, and she understood, with sick clarity, that there was no lie sophisticated enough to survive the evidence her father had already assembled. "Papa." "Don't," he said, and his voice had dropped into a register she had heard directed at enemies, but never, not once in her entire life, at her. "Don't insult me with a lie. I raised you better than that, even if it seems lately that someone has taught you to forget everything I raised you to be." He rose from the table slowly, and the movement itself felt like a verdict being delivered. "Tell me the truth, Sofia, right now. What is your relationship to Alessandro Bianchi?" She could have lied. She could have manufactured some story about reconnaissance, about gathering intelligence for the family under the guise of intimacy. A story her father, given his worldview, might even have believed, might even have praised her for. It would have been easy. It would have been safe. She thought of Alessandro's hands on her stomach that morning, reverent and careful, whispering promises to a child not yet visible to anyone but them. She thought of 11 weeks of stolen evenings, of a man who had shown her a version of himself no one else alive had seen, of a love that had crept up on her so slowly she hadn't noticed it arriving until it had already become the truest thing in her life. She would not build their future on a lie told to protect herself. "I'm carrying his child," she said. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Sofia had ever heard in her life. Her father's face went through a transformation she would remember for the rest of her days. Shock first, pure and total, followed by a fury so absolute it seemed to age him a decade in the space of a single breath, and then, worst of all, a cold and terrible calm that she recognized with dawning horror as the exact expression he wore in the moments before he ordered someone's death. "Get out," he said very quietly. "Get out of my house and pray to whatever God you still believe in that I don't decide before the sun sets tonight that the only way to cleanse this family's bloodline is to make sure that child never draws its first breath. Sofia was 3 blocks from the estate, driving with hands that wouldn't stop shaking when her phone rang with a number she'd memorized, despite never saving it, precisely for moments like this. "He knows," she said, before Alessandro could speak. "He knows everything, Alessandro. I told him. I couldn't lie to him, not about this. And he told me to get out. He said—" Her voice cracked, the composure she'd maintained through the entire confrontation finally shattering now that she was alone. "He said he might kill the baby before it's even born." He meant it. I've never seen him look at me like that. "Where are you right now?" Alessandro's voice had gone flat and fast, the voice of a man already in motion, already 3 steps ahead of the danger. "Driving. I don't know where. I just needed to get away from the house." "Listen to me carefully." His voice softened just enough to cut through her panic without losing its urgency. "Do not go back to your apartment. Do not go anywhere your father's people would expect. There's a diner on 14th and 9th. Small place. Greek family runs it. No cameras out front. Go there now. I'm 11 minutes out." She made it in 6, hands still trembling as she slid into a corner booth with her back to the wall, the way she'd been taught to sit since childhood, without ever understanding until now exactly why it mattered. Alessandro arrived 4 minutes after her, and the moment he walked through the door, something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the dining room finally, marginally, loosened. He didn't say anything at first. He simply crossed the diner, slid into the booth beside her instead of across from her, and pulled her against his chest with an urgency that spoke louder than any words could have. "I've got you," he murmured into her hair. "I've got you. You're safe." "He's going to come after me," she said against his shirt, her voice muffled and raw. "You don't know him the way I do, Alessandro. When he decides something is a threat to the family, he doesn't hesitate. He won't see a grandchild. He'll see a weapon in enemy hands." "He won't get the chance," Alessandro said, and pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes hard and certain, in a way that steadied her despite everything. "I've had a location prepared for months, in case something like this happened. A property upstate, registered to no one connected to either family, bought through 6 shell corporations, staffed by men who answer only to me, off any map your father's people would think to check. You're going there tonight." "And you?" "I'll join you as soon as I've secured things here," he said. "But Sofia, I need you to understand something. Once we do this, once you disappear from your father's reach, there's no quiet way back. He'll know exactly who took you. It will be an act of war he cannot ignore, not without losing face in front of every family that respects him. Are you prepared for that? Because there's no undoing it once it's done." Sofia thought of the coldness in her father's eyes, the terrible calm of a man deciding whether his own grandchild deserved to live, and felt any hesitation dissolve into something harder and more certain than fear. "He already declared war the moment he threatened my child," she said. "I'm not choosing a side today, Alessandro. I chose it 11 weeks ago, the first night I let myself fall for you instead of running." Something fierce and tender moved across his face, and he kissed her forehead with a gentleness that contrasted violently with the danger gathering around them. "Then let's go," he said, "before he has time to think of the same diner I did." They left through the kitchen, out a service door that opened onto an alley where a nondescript black SUV waited with its engine already running, driven by a man Sofia didn't recognize, but whose watchful professional stillness told her everything she needed to know about his competence. Alessandro helped her into the back seat with a careful hand at the small of her back, the same gesture from the gala months and a lifetime ago, and climbed in beside her, already dialing Enzo, already issuing orders in the low, controlled voice of a man rearranging the pieces of a war he'd been quietly preparing for. Sofia watched the city blur past the window, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the chaos of the morning, that there was no going back to the life she'd known. Her father had made his choice in that dining room. Now she would make hers. "Alessandro," she said quietly, as the SUV merged onto the highway heading north. "Promise me something." "Anything." "Promise me that whatever happens next, whatever this war costs us, you won't let it turn you into him." She turned to look at him, searching his face for the answer before he gave it. "I fell for the man who cooks in his dead mother's kitchen, not the man your father raised you to become. Don't let this war take that man away from me." Alessandro's throat worked once, and he reached over to lace his fingers through hers, holding on like she was the only solid thing left in a world coming apart at the seams. "I promise," he said. "Whatever it costs me, I promise." Matteo Moretti did not throw things. He did not shout, did not break furniture in fits of rage the way lesser men allowed themselves the luxury of doing. His fury, when it came, was silent and total. A stillness that settled over him like frost, and it was this silence, worse than any shouted threat, that his lieutenants had learned to fear most in 3 decades of service. He stood at the window of his study for nearly an hour after Sofia's car pulled away from the estate, watching the long driveway with the particular stillness of a man deciding how many lives he was willing to spend on his answer. "Sir," his head of security, Vincenzo, hovered in the doorway, unwilling to enter without invitation, unwilling to leave without instruction. "What are your orders?" "Bring me everything we have on Alessandro Bianchi," Matteo said, without turning. "Every property he owns, every shell company, every man who reports to him, and every weakness those men have. Debts, mistresses, sick mothers, gambling problems. I want to know this man better than he knows himself by morning." "And your daughter?" The question hung in the air, and Vincenzo, who had known Sofia since she was an infant in her mother's arms, who had taught her to ride a bicycle in the estate's long driveway when her father had been too busy with business to bother, watched his employer's shoulders tighten with something that might have been grief buried so deep it had calcified into fury. "My daughter," Matteo said slowly, "made her choice this afternoon. She chose the enemy over her own blood. I raised her better than that. I raised her to understand what this family has survived, what it cost her grandfather and her uncles to keep the Moretti name standing after everything the Bianchis took from us." His voice, when it finally broke from its flat calm, carried decades of grief he had never once allowed himself to show. "Her mother would be ashamed of her." "With respect, sir," Vincenzo said carefully, "her mother would want her daughter safe, whatever else is true." Matteo turned then, and the look on his face silenced whatever else Vincenzo might have said. "Her mother is dead," he said, "and I am the only thing standing between this family and a Bianchi grandchild being used to erase everything 3 generations of Morettis bled to protect. Do not mistake my grief for weakness, Vincenzo. I have buried a wife and a brother, and more men than I can count defending this family's name. I will not let a moment of foolish infatuation undo all of it. What exactly are you planning to do? Matteo was quiet for a long moment, his eyes returning to the empty driveway, to the space where his daughter's car had disappeared 20 minutes before. I am going to find her, he said finally, and I am going to bring her home, whatever that requires. And then, once she is safe within these walls again, I am going to end this war the way it should have ended 11 years ago, by removing Alessandro Bianchi from the world entirely, so that neither he nor his bloodline ever threatens this family again. And the child? The silence that followed was longer this time, and something in Matteo Moretti's face, some flicker of the man he might have been in another life, a life without generations of blood and vengeance weighing down every decision, moved briefly across his features before disappearing entirely. The child, he said finally, is Moretti blood, whatever else it is. I will not harm my own grandchild. His jaw tightened, old grief and old fury warring visibly in his expression. But that child will be raised a Moretti, in this house, protected by this family, far from any influence the Bianchi name might have on it. Sofia will understand, in time, that I am protecting her from a mistake she is too much in love to see clearly. Every daughter believes her father is the villain, in the moment he's actually trying to save her. Vincenzo, who had spent 30 years learning when to push back against his employer, and when silence was the only safe response, chose silence now, though something in his chest ached at the certainty in Matteo's voice, the absolute conviction of a man who had never once considered that he might be wrong. "Assemble the men," Matteo said, turning back to his desk, already reaching for the phone that would set in motion a war neither family could fully control once it began. "We move within the week. I want Alessandro Bianchi found, and I want my daughter brought home, and I don't particularly care anymore how much blood it costs to make both of those things true." Outside, the late afternoon light had begun to fade into the long grey dusk of autumn, and somewhere on the highway heading north, unaware of the exact shape of the storm now gathering behind her, Sofia Moretti pressed a hand against her stomach and allowed herself, for the first time in hours, to breathe. The property Alessandro had chosen sat at the end of a long gravel road in the Hudson Valley, a converted farmhouse surrounded by 40 acres of forest that made it nearly impossible to approach unseen, staffed by 4 men whose loyalty Alessandro had personally verified over years rather than months. Sofia stood in the kitchen that first evening, watching the sun set over the tree line through windows that felt, for the first time in her life, like they were protecting her rather than displaying her for someone else's judgment. "It's beautiful," she said when Alessandro found her there, still in the clothes she'd worn to her father's dining room that morning, a lifetime ago. "My mother used to talk about a place like this," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere the family business couldn't reach. She never got it. My father always found the reason it wasn't practical, wasn't secure enough, wasn't worth the resources." He was quiet for a moment. "I bought this place 4 years ago and never told him. I think some part of me always knew I'd need somewhere like this eventually. I just didn't know it would be for this." Sofia turned to look at him, taking in the exhaustion in his face, the toll the day had clearly taken, even on a man who had built his entire life around controlling chaos. "Are you all right?" "I should be asking you that." I asked first. A small, tired smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'm furious," he admitted, "at your father for threatening you, at my own father, who I haven't even told yet, and who I know will react just as badly, if not worse, once he learns. At myself for not moving faster, for not having this arranged before your father found out, instead of scrambling in the aftermath." He exhaled slowly. "But mostly, I'm just relieved you're safe. Everything else is noise compared to that." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and rested her forehead against his chest, letting herself finally feel the exhaustion and terror of the day, now that there was someone solid to lean into. "I keep thinking about what he said," she admitted quietly. "That he might not let the baby be born. I know him, Alessandro. I know when he's bluffing and when he isn't, and today he wasn't bluffing." Alessandro's arms tightened around her, and she felt the barely restrained violence in the gesture, the promise of a man who would burn the world down before he let harm reach her. "He will not touch you," he said again, the same vow he'd made weeks ago, except now it carried the weight of everything that had happened since. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care what it means for either of our families. I will not let him or anyone else hurt you or this child." "You keep promising things no one can actually guarantee," she said, though there was no accusation in it now, only a kind of exhausted tenderness. "Then let me show you instead of telling you," he said, and led her upstairs to a bedroom that overlooked the darkening forest, where he undressed her slowly, reverently, as though trying to memorize every inch of her against the possibility that the world might try to take this from them too. They made love that night, with a desperation neither of them named aloud. Not the playful hunger of the gala, not the growing tenderness of the townhouse, but something rawer, something that tasted like both of them silently acknowledging how close they'd come to losing this before it had even fully begun. Afterward, curled against his chest, with his hand resting protectively over the small curve of her stomach, Sofia allowed herself, for the first time since the pregnancy test in her father's bathroom, to imagine a future. Not a fantasy exactly, but something closer to a plan. A life somewhere far from both families' shadows. A child who would grow up without learning to flinch at raised voices, without being taught which fork to use for which enemy, without inheriting a war 2 generations older than either of its parents. "What are you thinking?" Alessandro murmured into her hair. "That I want this to be real," she said. "Not just the safe house, not just tonight. All of it. A life where our child doesn't grow up the way either of us did." "It will be real," he said, with a certainty she desperately wanted to believe. "I'm going to end this war, Sofia. Not manage it, not negotiate a temporary truce the way our fathers have done my whole life. End it, whatever that costs." She lifted her head to look at him, searching his face in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "And if it costs your relationship with your father, your place in the family?" "Then it costs that," he said simply. "I've spent my whole life being told that loyalty to blood matters more than anything else. I'm starting to think that's a lie men like our fathers tell themselves, to justify all the things they've done in the name of family. I don't want that kind of loyalty anymore. I want this." His hand pressed more firmly against her stomach, over the life they'd made together. I want a family that doesn't require anyone to die to protect it. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and somewhere far to the south, in a mansion built on old grudges, Matteo Moretti was already setting in motion the machinery of a war that would test exactly how far both of them were willing to go to keep that promise. The call came 4 days later, and it came not from Matteo Moretti, but from Alessandro's own father, a fact that told Alessandro before Salvatore even spoke that Enzo's careful discretion had finally failed somewhere along the chain. "My office," Salvatore Bianchi said, his voice still carrying traces of the slurred weakness the stroke had left behind, though none of the menace had diminished with it. "Tonight, alone." Alessandro left Sofia at the farmhouse with 2 of his most trusted men and drove into the city with a knot of dread sitting low in his stomach, the particular dread of a man who had spent his entire life anticipating his father's disappointment and had never once found a way to fully brace himself against it. Salvatore's office occupied the ground floor of the family's Upper East Side townhouse, converted after the stroke into a space he could navigate without the stairs that had once defined his domain. He sat behind his desk in a wheelchair he refused to be seen using anywhere else. His once powerful frame diminished, but his eyes, when Alessandro entered, as sharp and cold as they had ever been. "Sit," Salvatore said. "I'll stand." "Sit down, Alessandro." The old man's voice carried a warning that Alessandro, despite everything, still found himself obeying out of 30 years of ingrained deference. "I received an interesting phone call this afternoon. From Matteo Moretti himself, if you can believe it. The first time that man has spoken to me directly in 11 years. He informed me that my son has taken his daughter, that she is pregnant, that he expects me to return her along with whatever child she's carrying, or he will consider it an act of war against his entire family." Alessandro's jaw tightened. "I didn't take her, father. I protected her. Her own father threatened to kill the child rather than let it be born." "I don't particularly care about the details," Salvatore said, his voice flat and cold, in a way that made Alessandro's skin prickle with old childhood fear. "What I care about is that my son, my heir, the man I have spent 28 years shaping into someone capable of protecting this family, has gotten a Moretti pregnant and hidden her from her father like some lovesick fool in a fairy tale. Do you have any idea what you've done? Any idea what this exposes us to?" "I know exactly what I've done," Alessandro said, meeting his father's eyes without flinching, a defiance he had rarely allowed himself in this room. "I've fallen in love with a woman who deserves better than either of our family's war, and I intend to protect her and our child, no matter what it costs." Something dangerous moved across Salvatore's face. Not the rage Alessandro had expected, but something colder, more calculating. "Love," he repeated, with the particular contempt of a man who had buried his own capacity for it decades ago. "You think this is about love? Alessandro, listen to me carefully, because I am only going to explain this once." He leaned forward as far as his diminished body would allow. "That child, a Moretti Bianchi child, is the single most valuable piece of leverage either family has held against the other in 2 generations. If we return the girl and the child to Matteo out of some sentimental gesture, we hand him nothing but a symbol of our weakness. But if we keep her here, under our protection, raise that child within this family." His eyes glittered with an old familiar hunger for advantage. "We hold a blood claim that could finally force Matteo Moretti to kneel. A grandchild he cannot bring himself to destroy, held by the enemy. Do you understand what that means for us?" "She is not a bargaining chip," Alessandro said, low and furious, "and neither is our child. I will not use either of them as leverage against her father, no matter what advantage it might buy this family." "Then you are a fool," Salvatore said, "and a weaker man than I raised you to be." His voice hardened into something absolute. "I am giving you an order, Alessandro. Bring the girl here. She will be protected. She will be cared for. I am not a monster, whatever you think of me. But she and the child will remain under this family's control until this war is settled on our terms. If you refuse—" "If I refuse what?" Alessandro stood, something cold and final settling into his voice. "You'll disown me? Strip my position?" "Father, I have run this family's operations for 2 years while you recovered. The men answer to me now, not to you. You built an empire on fear and blood feuds that have cost this family as much as they've cost the Morettis, and I am done inheriting a war neither of us started. Sofia and our child are not weapons. I will not deliver them to you or to anyone else." Salvatore's face had gone a dangerous shade of red, and for a moment Alessandro feared the confrontation might trigger another stroke, might end this argument in a way neither of them wanted. But the old man mastered himself, breathing slow and deliberate, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. "You misunderstand me, Alessandro," he said softly. "I was giving you the courtesy of an order because you are my son. But I did not survive 40 years in this business by relying on courtesy when it fails." His eyes met his son's, cold and unblinking. "I already know where the property is. I have known for 3 days. I was simply waiting to see whether you would bring her to me willingly, or whether I would need to send men to collect her myself." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath Alessandro's feet. "You wouldn't," he said, though even as he said it, he knew, with the particular horror of a son finally seeing his father clearly for the first time, that he absolutely would. Alessandro broke every traffic law he knew driving back to the farmhouse, his phone pressed to his ear, Enzo's voice tight with alarm on the other end. "How long ago did your father find the location?" Enzo asked. "He said 3 days. I don't know if he's bluffing to provoke a reaction, but I can't afford to assume he is." Alessandro's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the city lights blurring past as he pushed the car faster than was strictly safe. "Get every man we have moving toward the farmhouse, now. If my father sends anyone before I get there—" "I'm already on it," Enzo said. "But Alessandro, if Salvatore really has known for 3 days and hasn't acted yet, that tells you something. He wanted to give you the chance to hand her over willingly first. That means he still believes he can control this without violence. The moment you refused him tonight, that calculation may have changed." Alessandro's stomach twisted with a fear he hadn't felt since childhood. Not fear for himself, but the deeper, more helpless fear of a man racing against a danger he might not reach in time. "Call the farmhouse, now.
Tell my men to move Sofia to the secondary location immediately. No explanation needed, just move her.
He drove the next 40 minutes in a state of controlled panic he had never before experienced. Every mile marker feeling like an eternity, every red light a small betrayal of time he didn't have. When he finally turned onto the long gravel drive, headlights sweeping across the tree line, his heart seized at the sight of an unfamiliar car parked at odd angles near the farmhouse's front porch, its doors hanging open. He was out of his own car before it had fully stopped, weapon drawn from habit more than conscious decision, moving toward the house with the particular deadly focus he had spent his whole life training for and had never before had to use for someone, this personal. The front door hung open. Inside, he found one of his own men on the floor, unconscious but breathing, a gash above his eyebrow already swelling. His second man stood in the kitchen doorway, weapon still drawn, breathing hard. "Where is she?" Alessandro said, and his voice didn't sound like his own. "She's safe," the man said quickly, seeing the barely restrained violence in his employer's face. "Two of your father's men came 15 minutes ago. Marco fought them off long enough for us to get her out the back through the tree line before they could reach the house. She's with Rossi, moving toward the secondary location on foot. I stayed to secure this one." He gestured at the wounded man. "The intruders left when they realized they'd lost her. I don't think they expected resistance." Relief crashed through Alessandro so hard it nearly buckled his knees, followed almost instantly by a fury so complete it felt like ice in his veins. His own father had sent men to seize Sofia by force, had been willing to risk her safety and the safety of his own unborn grandchild to win a strategic advantage in a war Alessandro had explicitly told him he wanted no part of. "Get him to a hospital," Alessandro said, already moving toward the tree line. "Discreet doctor, not an ER. I'm going to find her." He found Sofia and Rossi nearly a mile into the forest, huddled in the shelter of an old hunting blind, Sofia's face pale with terror, but her composure remarkably intact, one hand pressed protectively over her stomach, as she'd clearly done throughout the entire ordeal. The moment she saw him, something in her seemed to collapse with relief, and she was in his arms before he'd fully reached her, shaking, her fingers digging into the fabric of his jacket like she needed physical proof he was real. "Your father's men," she said against his chest, her voice raw. "They came for me, Alessandro. They said—" She pulled back to look at him, eyes wide with a horror that went beyond simple fear. "They said Salvatore wanted me brought to him alive, unharmed, that the baby was too valuable to risk in a fight. They talked about me like I was cargo." "I know," Alessandro said, and the shame and fury in his voice was so raw that Sofia's expression softened despite everything. "I confronted him tonight. I told him I wouldn't hand you over, and I didn't know— I swear to you, Sofia, I didn't know he'd already sent men before I even had the chance to warn you." "I believe you," she said, and something in the simple certainty of those two words undid something tightly wound in his chest. "But Alessandro, this isn't just your father's war anymore, or my father's. We're not going to be safe anywhere either family can reach. Not the farmhouse, not the townhouse, not anywhere either of them thinks to look, eventually." Alessandro held her face in both hands, forcing his own fear and rage down beneath something steadier, something he needed her to see clearly in this moment. "Then we stop hiding," he said. "I'm done running from both of our fathers, Sofia. It's time to end this, not with another safe house, not with another temporary solution. I need to force both families to the table, together, and make them choose between their war and losing everything they've spent generations building. How? She asked, searching his face for the plan she could see already forming behind his eyes. How do you force two men who have hated each other for 2 generations to sit down at the same table? Alessandro's expression hardened into something resolute, something that reminded her, despite everything, exactly why his enemies feared him. I give them no other choice, he said. The plan Alessandro assembled over the following 2 days was, by his own admission, the single riskiest gambit of his professional life, and he had built that life on calculated risk the way other men built careers on caution. You want to bring them both into the same room, Enzo said, staring at him across the kitchen table of a third, newly secured safe house, this one on the coast, chosen specifically because neither family had any prior connection to the area. Matteo Moretti and Salvatore Bianchi, 2 men who haven't been in the same building in over a decade without one of them trying to have the other killed. That's exactly what I want, Alessandro said. And you think they'll come? I think, Alessandro said, that Matteo Moretti wants his daughter and his grandchild safe, more than he wants to win a war he's been losing men and money to for 2 generations. And I think my father, whatever else he is, still wants an heir who isn't actively working to burn down everything he's built. Which means he'll come to try to talk me out of whatever he thinks I'm planning. He spread a set of documents across the table, financial records, shipping manifests, evidence of decades of mutual destruction that had cost both families more than either had ever openly admitted. I'm not proposing peace out of sentiment, Enzo. I'm proposing it as the only rational conclusion any competent businessman would reach if he actually looked at the numbers. This war has cost both families a combined estimate of over $400 million in the last decade alone. Lost product, dead men, legal fees, insurance, territory ceded to smaller operations who've profited from our mutual distraction. I intend to make that case so plainly that refusing to end it becomes the irrational position. And if they refuse anyway? If pride wins over profit the way it usually does with men like them? Alessandro's expression darkened. Then I have a second plan, one I'd rather not need. Sofia, who had been listening from the doorway with a hand resting on the curve of her stomach, more visible now, 3 months along, a fact that made the stakes of everything feel more urgently real with each passing week, stepped into the room. Tell him the second plan, she said quietly. Alessandra's jaw tightened. If they refuse to negotiate, I go public. Every piece of evidence in these files, money laundering routes, illegal shipments, the names of officials on both payrolls, goes to federal prosecutors and select journalists simultaneously, timed to implicate both families equally. Mutually assured destruction. If neither of them will choose peace, I make sure neither of them survives war either. Not through violence, but through exposure. Everything they've built, gone, in exchange for stubbornness. The room went very quiet. You'd destroy your own family's empire, Enzo said slowly, to force a peace neither of them wants. I'd destroy an empire built on my mother's grave and my uncle's blood and 2 generations of men who died for a grudge neither Matteo Moretti nor my father can even fully explain anymore, Alessandro said, something old and weary moving beneath the steel in his voice. I'm not interested in inheriting that, Enzo.
Not anymore. I want my child to inherit something worth having. Sofia crossed the room and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his in front of Enzo without hesitation, a public claiming of the bond between them that felt, in that moment, like its own kind of declaration of war against everyone who wanted to keep them apart. "I'll go with you," she said.
"When you present this to them, I want my father to see me stand beside you willingly, not as a hostage, not as leverage, as a woman who chose this." "It's dangerous," Alessandro said. "Both of them in the same room, both of them capable of violence if this goes wrong. I've spent my whole life watching men decide things about my future in rooms I wasn't allowed into," Sofia said, steel entering her own voice now. The same steel Alessandro had first glimpsed at the gala all those months ago, before either of them knew what they were walking into. "I'm not doing that again. Whatever happens in that room, I want to be standing in it." Alessandro studied her for a long moment, something fierce and proud moving across his face, and then nodded once, decisively. "Then we do it together," he said. Enzo set the meeting, neutral ground, the old shipping office on the pier, territory belonging to neither family, symbolic enough that both of them will understand exactly what it means to be summoned there. "When?" Alessandro glanced at Sofia, at the slight curve of her stomach, at the future they were both, impossibly, still fighting to build, despite everything arrayed against them. 3 days, he said, before either of them has time to plan something we can't walk back from. The old shipping office on the pier had belonged, decades ago, to a third family long since absorbed or destroyed by the wars that had reshaped the city's underworld. And its neutrality now was less about ownership than about the simple fact that neither Moretti nor Bianchi could claim home advantage within its walls. Alessandro had chosen it deliberately for exactly that reason, and as he stood in the cavernous, half-empty warehouse space on the appointed evening, watching 2 black convoys arrive from opposite ends of the pier within minutes of each other, he felt the full weight of the gamble settle onto his shoulders. Matteo Moretti arrived first, flanked by 6 armed men, his face a mask of controlled fury the moment his eyes found his daughter standing beside Alessandro rather than being held against her will. Which Alessandro understood, watching the old man's expression flicker with confusion and then something like grief, had been precisely the scenario Matteo had convinced himself was true. "Sofia!" Her father's voice cracked, just slightly, on her name. "You're standing beside him. Willingly."
"I am, Papa." Sofia's voice was steady, though Alessandro could feel the tension radiating off her, could see her hand tighten fractionally around his own. "No one is holding me here. I came because I want this war to end, and because I love this man, and because our child deserves a future that doesn't require either of you to keep bleeding for a fight that started before either of us was born." Salvatore Bianchi arrived 4 minutes later, wheeled in by 2 of his men, his diminished body doing nothing to dim the cold authority in his eyes as they swept the room and settled, with visible displeasure, on his son, standing beside a Moretti, in full view of both families' men. "This is either the bravest thing you've ever done," Salvatore said to his son, "or the stupidest. I haven't decided which." "It's neither," Alessandro said, stepping forward into the space between the 2 men who had spent their entire lives trying to destroy each other. "It's simple arithmetic. I've brought documentation for both of you. Financial losses, casualty counts, opportunity costs, spanning the entirety of this war's 2nd generation. I'd like 15 minutes of your attention before either of you decides how tonight ends." What followed was, by Alessandro's own later account, the longest 15 minutes of his life. He laid out, with the same cold precision he brought to every negotiation, the staggering true cost of a war that had, by his calculations, cost both families a combined total exceeding $420 million over the past decade alone. Territory lost to rival organizations who had capitalized on their mutual distraction.
Legal exposure accumulated through decades of retaliatory violence that had drawn increasing federal attention to both families, and a body count on both sides that, when tallied together and read aloud in the flat, unemotional cadence of a businessman presenting quarterly losses, seemed to physically age both old men where they stood. "You've turned my life's work into a spreadsheet," Salvatore said when Alessandro finished, his voice tight with something between fury and grudging respect. "I've turned it into what it actually was the whole time," Alessandro said. "A catastrophically unprofitable feud that neither of you has been willing to end because pride matters more to both of you than the empires you claim to be protecting." Matteo, who had remained silent through the entire presentation, finally spoke, his eyes fixed on his daughter rather than on Alessandro. "And what do you propose instead? A truce, sealed by a baby neither family asked for? You expect me to simply forgive 2 generations of blood because my daughter fell in love with the wrong man at the wrong gala? I expect you to choose your daughter and your grandchild over a war that has already cost you more than it's ever given you," Alessandro said. "I'm not asking you to forgive anything, Signor Moretti. I'm asking you to be rational. Your daughter is happy. Your grandchild will be born in 6 months into a family that could either be at war or at peace. You get to choose which. I've laid out in detail exactly what continuing this war will cost both families going forward. And I promise you, gentlemen, I am prepared to ensure those costs materialize whether you agree to peace tonight or not."
Something shifted in Matteo's expression. Not surrender, not yet, but the first flicker of a man doing math he didn't want to do, weighing pride against the daughter standing in front of him with her hand pressed protectively over a grandchild he had, despite everything, already begun to think of as his own. "And if I refuse," Salvatore said, his eyes narrowing at his son, "what exactly is this threat you're prepared to follow through on?" Alessandro reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick folder, setting it on the table between the two patriarchs with the deliberate finality of a man laying down a winning hand.
"Everything in this folder goes to federal prosecutors within 72 hours if either of you attempts to harm Sofia, our child, or interferes with our lives going forward. Money laundering routes, officials on both payrolls, every shipment, every account, every name. I've built dossiers on both families equally, gentlemen, because I have no interest in destroying only one side of this war. If it burns together." His voice went very quiet, very final. "I would rather see everything both of you have built turn to ash than let either of you touch what's mine." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the pier outside, and Sofia, watching the 2 most powerful men in her life stare at each other across a table stacked with evidence of their own mutual destruction, understood that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine the entire shape of the future her child would be born into. It was Salvatore who moved first, and not in the way anyone in the room expected. The old man's hand slid, slow and deliberate, toward the inside of his jacket, and one of Matteo's men, younger,
less disciplined than the veterans flanking his boss, twitchy with the accumulated tension of the entire standoff, misread the gesture as the beginning of an attack and drew his weapon before anyone could stop him.
The shot that followed happened so fast that Sofia would spend weeks afterward trying to reconstruct the exact sequence of events. The way memory fractures under sufficient trauma into disconnected fragments that never quite reassemble into a coherent whole. She remembered Alessandro's arm sweeping across her body, shoving her sideways and down with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. She remembered the deafening crack of gunfire in the enclosed warehouse space, amplified by concrete and steel into something that seemed to physically shake the air. She remembered Matteo Moretti shouting something in Italian, furious and terrified in equal measure, as his men moved to disarm their own overzealous colleague. She remembered, with a horror that would return to her in nightmares for months, Alessandro's body jerking as the bullet meant for no one in particular found him instead, having ricocheted off a steel support beam at an angle no one could have predicted. "Alessandro!" She was on her knees beside him before she'd consciously decided to move, her hands pressing uselessly against the spreading dark stain blooming across his side, her own protective instincts toward her unborn child momentarily eclipsed entirely by a terror more primal and absolute than anything she had ever experienced. He was conscious, his face gone pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes found hers with a clarity that terrified her more than unconsciousness would have. "I'm all right," he managed, though the words came out strained through gritted teeth. "Sofia, the baby. I'm fine. We're fine. Don't you dare worry about anything except staying awake," she said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to sound steady, pressing harder against the wound as blood welled between her fingers. "Someone call an ambulance, now!" The warehouse erupted into controlled chaos, Enzo shouting orders, Salvatore's men and Matteo's men incredibly working together for the first time in either family's living memory to secure the perimeter and clear a path for emergency responders. The shared horror of the moment temporarily dissolving decades of enmity into something more urgent and human. Matteo Moretti himself knelt on Alessandro's other side, his face ashen, staring at the man he had spent months wanting dead, now bleeding out on the floor of a neutral warehouse because of his own man's mistake. "Stay with us," Matteo said gruffly, surprising everyone in the room, including himself, pressing his own jacket against the wound to help staunch the bleeding. "You hear me, Bianchi? You do not get to die on this floor after that speech about spreadsheets. My daughter would never forgive either of us." Alessandro's mouth curved, even through the pain, into something almost like a smile. "Didn't peg you," he managed weakly, "for a man who'd save my life." "I'm not saving your life for you," Matteo said, gruff and furious, and beneath it, unmistakably frightened for his daughter's sake. "I'm saving it for her. Don't mistake the difference." The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later, 11 minutes that felt to Sofia like the longest of her entire life. Each one measured out in the increasingly shallow rhythm of Alessandro's breathing, in the growing paleness of his face, in the terror that she might lose him now, after everything, after finally believing they might actually build something worth the danger. She rode with him in the ambulance,
refusing to be separated despite the paramedics' protests, holding his hand through the entire frantic ride to the hospital while he drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring her name, murmuring apologies for a plan that had nearly gotten him killed. "Don't you dare apologize," she said fiercely, gripping his hand as the ambulance doors flew open and he was rushed into the emergency room, the paramedics finally, forcibly, separating them at the doors to surgery.
"Don't you dare leave me to raise this baby alone after everything you promised me." The waiting room of the hospital that night held an unprecedented sight. Matteo Moretti and Salvatore Bianchi, seated in adjacent chairs, neither man speaking, both watching the doors of the operating room with the same desperate, helpless attention, united for the first time in over a decade by something neither of their wars had ever managed to accomplish: genuine shared fear for the same life. Sofia sat between them, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, the other twisting a tissue to shreds in her lap, and prayed to a God she wasn't entirely sure she still believed in, that the man she loved would walk out of those doors alive. The surgery lasted 4 hours, and when the doctor finally emerged, his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man trained not to give away good news or bad news before he'd fully delivered it, Sofia felt her entire body go rigid with dread. "He's stable," the doctor said, and the words seemed to physically knock the air out of the room, out of Sofia's lungs, out of the collective held breath of two rival patriarchs who had spent the last 4 hours sitting 3 feet apart in a silence neither had known how to break. The bullet fragmented on impact with the support beam before it hit him, which actually worked in his favor, reduced the velocity, kept it from doing the kind of damage a direct hit would have caused. "We removed the fragments, repaired the damage to his lower intercostal muscle, and he lost a significant amount of blood, but barring complications, he should make a full recovery." Sofia's knees nearly buckled with relief, and it was, absurdly, Salvatore Bianchi's hand that caught her elbow to steady her, the old man's face carrying an expression she had never expected to see directed at her, something almost gentle, almost grandfatherly, entirely at odds with everything she'd been raised to believe about the Bianchi patriarch. "He'll want to see you first," Salvatore said quietly, once the doctor had gone to arrange her visit, "when he wakes." "You're not angry?" Sofia said, studying the old man's face with genuine confusion. "About tonight? About all of it?" Salvatore was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the doors of the recovery room where his son lay, alive against considerable odds. "I watched my son take a bullet meant for no one in particular tonight. In the warehouse he chose specifically to force 2 old fools like myself and your father to finally stop killing each other over a grudge I can barely even remember the original cause of anymore," he said finally. "I have spent 30 years believing that strength meant never bending, never negotiating, never showing an enemy anything but a closed fist. My son just showed me, at the cost of nearly his own life, that strength might actually look like something else entirely." He looked at Sofia directly, something almost like respect in his weathered face. "I don't know what I believe anymore, Sofia Moretti, but I know I don't want to bury my son over a war that nearly cost him his life tonight for nothing more than my own stubbornness." Across the waiting room, Matteo Moretti sat with his head in his hands, and when Sofia approached him, uncertain what she would find, she discovered her father weeping, silently,
the way she had only seen him cry once before, at her mother's funeral, a grief he had never once allowed himself to show in the years since. "Papa," she said softly, sitting beside him. "I almost lost you," he said, his voice raw and broken in a way she had never heard from him. "Tonight, in that warehouse, I thought, for one terrible moment, that bullet had found you instead of him. And I understood, all at once, exactly what I've been risking with all of this. My pride, my grudges, my refusal to let go of a war that has already cost me your mother's peace of mind for the entirety of our marriage, has already cost this family more than I've ever admitted to myself." He turned to look at her, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "I don't know how to let go of 30 years of hatred overnight, Sofia. But I know that I cannot lose you the way I lost your mother. I won't survive burying you, too." "You don't have to let go of everything overnight," Sofia said gently, taking her father's hand, feeling something in her chest ache with a complicated mixture of old resentment and genuine, unguarded love for the flawed, grieving man beside her. "You just have to choose, every day, to try. That's all any of this requires, Papa. A choice, made new each morning, to want peace more than you want to be right." Matteo was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter's face, seeing in it, perhaps for the first time in years, not just his heir or his responsibility, but simply his child, grown into a woman brave enough to choose love over the war she'd been raised inside of. "Your mother would have loved him," he said finally, unexpectedly, nodding toward the recovery room doors. "Not because he's a Bianchi, because he clearly loves you exactly the way she always wanted for you, completely, recklessly, without calculation." He squeezed her hand. "I think I could learn to see that too, given time." When Sofia was finally allowed into the recovery room, she found Alessandro pale and weak against the white hospital sheets, tubes and monitors surrounding him. But his eyes opened the moment she entered, finding her across the room with the same unwavering focus she remembered from the night of the gala, months and a lifetime ago. "You're alive," she said, crossing the room quickly, careful of the wires and tubes as she took his hand in both of hers. "Told you," he said, his voice rough but carrying a thread of dark humour. "Hard to kill." "Don't joke about this," she said, though she was laughing and crying simultaneously, an overwhelming release of every fear she'd carried through the longest night of her life. "You scared me half to death, Alessandro Bianchi. I thought I was going to have to raise this baby, telling it stories about a father it never got to meet." "Not going to happen," he said, his hand tightening weakly around hers. "I made you a promise, remember? Whatever it cost. I meant it then, and lying in this bed with a hole in my side, I still mean it now." His eyes softened, something achingly tender moving across his exhausted face. "Did it work? The warehouse? Did they agree to peace? Or did I nearly die for nothing?" Sofia smiled through her tears, thinking of her father's broken confession in the waiting room, of Salvatore's unexpected gentleness, of two old enemies sitting 3 feet apart for 4 hours, united by fear for the same life. "I think," she said softly, "you nearly died
for exactly enough. 6 months later, Sofia stood on the terrace of the Brooklyn townhouse, no longer a secret, no longer hidden from either family, but renovated now into something that belonged fully to her and Alessandro, a home neither of their fathers' names hung over, and watched the late spring sun set over a garden she had spent the better part of her pregnancy learning to tend, in careful, deliberate tribute to a mother who had loved gardening and had never lived to see her daughter find any peace at all. Inside, she could hear Alessandro's voice, low and warm, murmuring nonsense to their daughter, born 3 weeks earlier, and already, in his obviously biased opinion, the most remarkable child to ever exist. They had named her Elena, after both of their mothers, a small, deliberate act of unification that had brought Matteo Moretti to unexpected tears when he'd learned of it, and had softened something in Salvatore Bianchi's weathered face that Sofia suspected hadn't fully softened in decades. The peace between the two families remained, 6 months on, exactly as fragile and exactly as real as Alessandro had warned her it would be. There had been no grand reconciliation, no sudden dissolution of decades of mistrust. Instead, there had been small, deliberate steps. A joint business venture neither family could have profitably pursued alone. A shared security arrangement along contested territory that had quietly ended the last vestiges of open conflict. Dinners between the two patriarchs that remained stiff and careful, but had, gradually, stopped requiring armed men stationed at every door. It was not friendship. Sofia doubted it would ever fully become that, but it was, unmistakably, an ending to the war that had shaped both their childhoods, replaced by something more fragile and more valuable. The possibility of a future their child would not have to inherit as a battlefield. Alessandro emerged onto the terrace, with Eleanor cradled against his chest. The sight of him, Bianchi Heir, feared throughout the underworld, reduced entirely to soft murmurs and careful hands around a sleeping infant, still capable of undoing something tender and disbelieving in Sofia's chest every single time she witnessed it. "She's asleep," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the terrace railing, careful not to jostle their daughter. "Finally. I think she inherited your stubbornness about bedtime." "She inherited your inability to admit defeat," Sofia countered, smiling as she reached out to smooth a strand of dark hair away from Elena's sleeping face. "Your father called earlier, by the way. He wants to know if we'll bring her to the house this weekend. He's apparently been telling anyone who'll listen at the club about his granddaughter." "God help us," Alessandro said, though his voice carried unmistakable warmth beneath the dry humour. 6 months ago that man was ready to use our daughter as a bargaining chip against your father. Now he's bragging about her to men who used to be terrified of him. "People change," Sofia said softly, "when something finally gives them a reason to want something more than winning." Alessandro was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of deep gold and violet, and Sofia recognized, in the particular stillness of his expression, the look of a man turning something important over in his mind before deciding to say it aloud. "I keep thinking about that night at the gala," he said finally. "How close I came to never asking you to dance. How close we both came to letting the masks stay on, letting the whole night pass without either of us risking anything real." He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw the same storm-coloured intensity she'd fallen for on that terrace all those months ago, though it had gentled now into something steadier, something that had weathered enough together to trust itself completely. "I don't believe in fate, Sofia. I was raised by a man who believes only in leverage and calculated risk. But I think, somehow, some part of me knew that night that I wasn't going to be able to walk away from you, even before I understood why. You almost did, she reminded him gently. You left before I woke up. I panicked, he admitted, with the ghost of a rueful smile. I'd just spent an entire night falling for a woman I'd convinced myself I could never actually have. It seemed easier, at the time, to disappear than to face what that meant. His arm came around her shoulders, drawing her closer against his side, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. I've spent every day since grateful you were braver than I was, that you came to find me instead of letting the mystery stay buried. Sofia leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, watching the last of the sunset fade into the soft blue of early evening over a city that had once felt, to both of them, like a battlefield they'd been born onto without ever being asked. It didn't feel that way anymore. It felt, standing here with the man she loved and the daughter they'd made together, like the beginning of something neither family's history had ever managed to offer either of them. A chance to choose, deliberately and completely, who they wanted to become, instead of simply inheriting who they'd been told to be. I love you, she said quietly, the words still capable, after everything, of feeling like a small miracle every time she said them aloud. Not the Bianchi heir, not the man my father warned me about, just you. The one who cooks in his dead mother's kitchen and reads pregnancy books in secret and cried the first time he held our daughter, even though he'll deny it if you ever bring it up in front of Enzo. I love you too, Alessandro said, pressing a kiss to her temple, his voice rough, with an emotion he no longer bothered trying to hide from her. Enemy's daughter. Braver than any man I've ever known. Mother of the only thing in this world I've ever wanted more than power. Below them, the city lights began to flicker on one by one, and somewhere far to the north, in two grand houses that had spent 2 generations at war, 2 old men sat in their separate studies, each thinking, in his own way, of a granddaughter who had done what neither bullets nor treaties nor 30 years of grief had ever managed to accomplish. She had ended a war simply by being born into a love neither family had believed was possible. Sofia Moretti and Alessandro Bianchi stood together on their terrace as the stars came out over the city that had once tried to keep them apart, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, and understood, with the quiet certainty of 2 people who had risked everything and won, that whatever else the world demanded of them, they would face it now exactly as they intended to face everything that came after. Together, unmasked and unafraid.